Have you ever noticed how a single glance can ripple through your heart and mind in ways you barely recognize? What we choose to see or avoid seeing shapes our inner world, influencing our thoughts, emotions, and even our sense of self-worth. Lowering the gaze is not merely about avoiding the forbidden, it is about protecting the soul, cultivating mindfulness, and fostering a life of integrity and purpose. Every glance we cast carries weight far beyond the surface. When we lower our gaze, we are not merely following a rule, we are actively protecting our hearts, nurturing our inner clarity and guarding the purity of our intentions. The eyes are powerful conduits of attention. They direct the mind, inform the imagination, and shape the desires of the heart. To allow the gaze to wander carelessly is to invite subtle disturbances into our consciousness, feeding impulses and thoughts that often go unnoticed until they manifest in regrets or misaligned actions. Lowering the gaze then becomes an act of self-respect, conscious choice to refuse temporary visual gratification in favor of long-term spiritual and emotional alignment, because every moment of awareness strengthens the connection between intention and action, and every deliberate glance away from harm reinforces the heart's integrity. When we talk about lowering the gaze, it is critical to understand that this practice is not only about avoiding haram content, but also about cultivating mindfulness in how we navigate the world. Our eyes are constantly receiving information, and what we expose ourselves to leaves impressions on our consciousness. Choosing what to see is, therefore, an act of profound self-care. By intentionally redirecting attention, we minimize the risk of internalizing harmful thoughts or desires, and we begin to train the mind to focus on what nurtures rather than depletes our inner life. This discipline fosters a quiet strength, one that is not reactive to every stimulus, but remains steady, purposeful, and aligned with values that preserve dignity, spiritual health, and emotional well-being. In essence, lowering the gaze is a daily exercise in aligning vision with virtue, and it begins to shape patterns of thought, intention, and behavior that extend far beyond the immediate moment of looking. Furthermore, the act of controlling the gaze reinforces accountability. It reminds us that our hearts and minds are precious, and that what we allow in through our senses has the potential to shape the way we think, feel, and act. When we practice conscious control over what we watch, we are training ourselves in the larger art of self-governance, disciplining impulses, recognizing the subtle influence of external stimuli, and refusing to let temporary temptations dictate our values or choices. Lowering the gaze cultivates awareness of the invisible threads connecting what we see with what we think, what we desire, and ultimately how we live our lives. Prioritizing intentionality in this small yet powerful act, we begin to take responsibility for the subtle ways our environment shapes us, and we claim agency over the inner narrative of our hearts and minds. Lowering the gaze is also a form of respect for oneself, for others, and for the sacred trust we hold over our hearts. When we actively choose not to engage with content that undermines our dignity, we are affirming the value of our own soul and refusing to objectify others in ways that harm both parties. This conscious restraint transforms everyday interactions and cultivates a heightened sensitivity toward integrity, humility, and honor, shaping not just our vision, but our moral character and social interactions. Over time, this practice develops a strong foundation for self-discipline, enabling us to navigate other areas of life with intentionality, restraint, and clarity of purpose, demonstrating that the discipline of the gaze is not an isolated exercise, but a gateway to broader ethical and spiritual growth. It is important to recognize that lowering the gaze is not about restriction or fear, but about empowerment. By choosing where to focus, we reclaim control over our attention, our desires, and ultimately the quality of our inner life. Every deliberate act of turning away from distraction strengthens the heart's ability to resist impulses that compromise integrity, nurtures mindfulness in thought and behavior, and allows us to approach life with greater clarity and serenity. Through repeated practice, this discipline becomes a form of spiritual muscle. The more we exercise control over what enters our consciousness, the more naturally the heart and mind align with virtue, reflection, and inner peace. And we learn that true freedom arises not from indulgence, but from conscious restraint and alignment with principles that nurture both heart and soul. Finally, lowering the gaze is about cultivating a life that honors the delicate interplay between sight, thought, and intention. It is a practice that reinforces self-awareness, self-respect, and purposeful living, and it reminds us that the small choices where we look what we watch and what we allow into our consciousness accumulate over time, shaping character, desires, and ultimately the quality of our spiritual and emotional life. In this way, The discipline of the gaze becomes a cornerstone of broader personal transformation. It is a daily, actionable commitment to protect the heart, to cultivate virtue, and to align intention, thought, and action with a life of meaning, integrity, and inner peace. By mastering this subtle yet powerful practice, we unlock the capacity for deeper self-control, more mindful engagement with the world, and a life lived with clarity, purpose, and dignity. The practice of lowering the gaze is far more profound than simply avoiding Haram visuals. It is a deliberate, conscious act that reflects a deep understanding of how the heart, mind, and soul are influenced by what they consume, because every glance, whether fleeting or sustained, leaves an impression on the consciousness, subtly shaping thoughts, desires, and emotional responses. And over time, these impressions accumulate to form patterns that either uplift, purify, and align the heart with higher principles, or gradually erode integrity, emotional balance, and spiritual clarity. And I came to understand that the act of lowering the gaze is not a restriction imposed externally, but an internal discipline that cultivates mindfulness, self-respect, and moral agency, because it requires the individual to pause, reflect, and consciously decide what is worth their attention, understanding that the heart is precious and the mind's focus. As I began to reflect more deeply on the significance of lowering the gaze, I realized that this practice is not merely about avoiding the forbidden or externalizing obedience to rules, but about cultivating an ongoing awareness of the subtle ways in which the heart interacts with the world, because our eyes are powerful conduits through which information, imagery, and influences enter, shaping not only our immediate reactions, but also the deeper patterns of thought, emotion, and desire that guide our behavior over time. And it became clear that by deliberately choosing what to look at, we are engaging in a form of spiritual self-governance, conscious act of protecting the heart from harm while nurturing clarity, integrity, and inner peace. And I understood that this is not a one-time effort or a simple matter of discipline, but a continuous, intentional practice that requires patience, self-reflection, and repeated engagement, because the mind is constantly receiving stimuli and the heart is vulnerable to impressions that can either uplift or diminish its stability. And lowering the gaze becomes a protective and nurturing habit that gradually strengthens the capacity for discernment, focus, and alignment with higher values, because each deliberate act of redirecting attention reinforces the connection between intention and action, gradually shaping character, perception, and emotional response. And I began to notice that this practice also cultivates a deeper sense of accountability, because it reminds the individual that the choices we make, even those as seemingly small as where we look, have profound consequences on our mental, emotional, and spiritual state. And by consistently choosing restraint, awareness, and mindfulness, we train the heart to prioritize alignment with principles of dignity, respect, virtue, fostering a stronger, more resilient inner life. And I realized that this is not merely about self-restraint, but about creating a fertile environment within the heart and mind for clarity, purpose, and conscious engagement with life. Because when the gaze is disciplined, the heart is less burdened by unnecessary distractions, desires, or regrets, and the mind is better able to focus on reflection, gratitude, and constructive action. And I observed that the benefits of lowering the gaze extend beyond personal spiritual health, because this practice also shapes interpersonal interactions, cultivating respect for oneself and for others, reducing the tendency to objectify, judge, or internalize harmful impressions, and promoting a mindful, compassionate, and ethically aligned approach to relationships. Because when one learns to control attention and respect the sanctity of the heart, this discipline naturally extends into social conduct, enhancing empathy, patience, and understanding. And I came to recognize that this practice of conscious attention and intentional restraint is a foundational tool for broader self-discipline, because it builds the inner muscles of focus, patience, and moral clarity, which then influence decisions, habits, and emotional regulation in other areas of life, creating a ripple effect of personal growth and spiritual resilience. And I realized that lowering the gaze is ultimately about reclaiming agency over the inner landscape, understanding that the heart and mind are not passive vessels, but active participants in shaping the quality of our life experience. And that by protecting and nurturing them through mindful engagement, we cultivate a life marked by clarity, purpose, integrity, and a sustained connection with values that honor both the self and the divine. And as I continued to reflect, I saw that this seemingly simple act of consciously choosing where to look is in fact a profound expression of self-awareness, respect, and spiritual intentionality. because it trains the heart to recognize what is harmful and what is nurturing, gradually building a coherent, integrated, and resilient inner life. And it became clear to me that the act of lowering the gaze is less about external limitation and more about internal empowerment, fostering a capacity for discernment, reflection, and ethical consistency, because each deliberate act of looking away is simultaneously an act of protecting the soul, cultivating virtue, and strengthening the alignment between intention, thought, and behavior. And through repeated practice, the heart begins to experience clarity, stability, and a profound sense of integrity that permeates not only personal spiritual life, but also emotional, social, and moral dimensions, demonstrating that this small yet deliberate practice is a powerful gateway to holistic spiritual and psychological growth, because it cultivates mindfulness, self-discipline, and alignment with values that honor the dignity of the heart, the mind, and ultimately the life one seeks to live with meaning, purpose, and conscious intention. As I delved further into the practice of lowering the gaze, I began to understand that it is not merely an act of avoidance, but a profound exercise in cultivating intentionality and awareness in every aspect of life, because the eyes serve as the gateway to the mind and heart, and what we choose to see can shape our emotions, desires, thoughts, and ultimately our character. And I realized that controlling the gaze is one of the most accessible yet powerful ways to exercise self-discipline, for it requires a conscious, deliberate effort to resist momentary impulses and prioritize the long-term spiritual, emotional, and moral well-being of the self. And this effort is not limited to preventing exposure to harmful visuals alone, but extends into a larger practice of mindfulness, ethical awareness, and reflection, because each glance carries with it potential consequences, subtly reinforcing patterns of thought and desire that either uplift or erode the integrity of the heart. And I began to see that repeated acts of conscious restraint cultivate not only moral and spiritual strength, but also mental clarity and emotional resilience. Because when the mind is trained to filter what it absorbs, it becomes less prone to distraction, agitation, and unhealthy attachments, and more capable of focusing on that which nurtures purpose, gratitude, and inner peace. And this awareness led me to recognize that lowering the gaze is fundamentally an act of protecting the inner self, creating a safe space in which the heart can develop in alignment with principles of virtue, dignity, and ethical consistency. And I realized that this protective act is not a form of restriction, but rather a conscious, empowering choice that fosters mastery over impulses, clarity of intention, and coherence between one's beliefs and actions, because the heart is shaped less by the absence of temptation than by the deliberate choices we make in the presence of it. And I observed that the benefits of this practice extend far beyond spiritual discipline, influencing social interactions, personal relationships, and the cultivation of empathy and respect, because a heart that has learned to govern its attention and guard its purity naturally treats others with consideration, avoids objectification, and maintains ethical awareness in thought and conduct. And as I reflected, I came to appreciate that lowering the gaze is in fact a gateway to broader self-control, for the same discipline required to guard the eyes translates into greater patience, moral clarity, and resilience across other areas of life, shaping the way one responds to challenges, navigates desires, and makes decisions, because self-discipline is cultivated incrementally, beginning with small yet consistent acts of intentional restraint. And each of these acts strengthens the capacity for deeper, more comprehensive control over one's thoughts, emotions, and actions. And I realized that the subtle power of the gaze lies in its cumulative effect. Each conscious choice to look away, redirect attention, or focus on what is constructive reinforces patterns of integrity, mindfulness, and virtue that accumulate over time to shape not just isolated behavior, but character and identity, because character is the sum of repeated choices, and intentionality in small actions creates the foundation for larger transformations. And I began to understand that this practice requires ongoing reflection and awareness, because the heart is constantly exposed to stimuli that can either nourish or deplete it. And it is through repeated conscious engagement that the mind and heart learn to distinguish between what is harmful and what is nurturing, creating a framework for sustainable spiritual, emotional, and moral growth. And as I continued to practice lowering the gaze, I noticed a subtle yet profound shift in the inner landscape of my heart, a growing sense of calm clarity and focus, an increased capacity for empathy and compassion, and a strengthened ability to navigate challenges with patience, intentionality, and integrity. And I realized that these effects were not incidental. the natural outcome of consistent, conscious practice that aligns attention with values, and that this alignment is essential for holistic personal development because the heart, mind, and soul are interconnected, and shaping one dimension invariably influences the others, creating coherence, balance, and resilience. And I came to see that this practice also fosters humility and self-awareness because it reminds the individual that every choice matters, that the heart is delicate and influential, and that the cultivation of virtue requires vigilance, reflection, and sustained effort. And I understood that lowering the gaze is therefore not simply an external exercise, but an internal journey, a daily commitment to nurture integrity, clarity, and purpose, and that it strengthens the capacity to live in alignment with spiritual and ethical principles because intentional engagement with the simplest of actions, the direction of one's gaze, ripples outward, shaping the quality of thoughts, emotions, interactions, ultimately the trajectory of the soul. And as I reflected on the profound impact of this practice, I recognized that even seemingly small, repeated acts of conscious restraint can catalyze enduring transformation, fostering a life of greater mindfulness, moral clarity, emotional stability, and spiritual alignment, because the cumulative effect of these disciplined choices cultivates the foundation for holistic personal development, resilience, and a life lived in harmony with principles that nurture the heart, elevate the mind, and honor the sacredness of the soul, showing that lowering the gaze is not merely a rule to follow, but a practice of profound self-mastery, intentionality, and spiritual empowerment that shapes not only behavior, but character, consciousness, and the very quality of one's life experience. As I continued to reflect on the practice of lowering the gaze, I began to recognize that its significance extends far beyond the immediate act of averting the eyes from what is forbidden or inappropriate. It is, in essence, discipline of the heart and mind, a practice that nurtures the ability to exercise intentionality, mindfulness, and moral discernment in every area of life, because the eyes serve not merely as physical organs of sight, but as conduits through which thoughts, desires, and emotional responses are shaped. And what enters through them has a profound influence on the inner landscape of the self, shaping not only fleeting moments of reaction, but also long-term patterns of thought, intention, and character. And I realized that this awareness transforms the seemingly simple act of lowering the gaze into a powerful spiritual and psychological exercise because it trains the heart to prioritize long-term integrity over immediate gratification, reflection over impulsivity, and mindfulness over heedless absorption. And I came to see that this practice is deeply intertwined with self-respect because when one deliberately chooses what to look at, the individual is making a conscious statement about the value of their own inner life, recognizing that the heart is delicate, impressionable, and worthy of protection, and that cultivating clarity, virtue, and stability requires intentional effort, patience, and awareness. And as I observed my own patterns of attention and reflection, I noticed how much seemingly trivial or habitual glances could influence emotional states, thought processes, and even interactions with others, demonstrating that the practice of lowering the gaze is not merely symbolic, but has tangible effects on both the inner and outer dimensions of life, because each act of conscious restraint strengthens the alignment between belief, intention, and behavior, gradually creating coherence in character, clarity in thought, and resilience in emotion. And I began to understand that this practice also fosters a heightened sense of accountability because it reminds the individual that attention is not neutral and that what we allow into our consciousness shapes our desires, priorities, and interactions. And by actively choosing to protect the heart through mindful direction of the gaze, one cultivates a sense of responsibility toward oneself and others, developing empathy, respect, and ethical awareness, because a heart trained in conscious attention is less likely to internalize harmful impressions, objectify others, or act impulsively, and more likely to respond with thoughtfulness, patience, and integrity. And I noticed that the benefits of this practice are cumulative, as repeated acts of conscious restraint and mindful attention gradually reshape neural, emotional, and moral patterns, reinforcing clarity, self-control, and alignment with values, because the heart and mind are malleable, and intentional practice produces lasting transformation in the way we perceive, feel, and act. And I began to see that lowering the gaze is simultaneously a deeply personal and relational practice, because while it protects the inner self, it also enhances the quality of social interactions by cultivating respect, humility, and consideration for others, demonstrating that ethical awareness and spiritual discipline are inseparable from everyday life and relationships. And I understood that this practice requires consistent effort because the heart and mind are continuously exposed to stimuli that can either uplift or erode integrity. And without deliberate awareness and repeated engagement, it is easy for attention to drift, desires to be influenced, and the inner balance to be disturbed. And I recognize that the discipline of the gaze is not a restrictive imposition, but an empowering choice because it cultivates the ability to navigate the world with intentionality, clarity, and moral discernment, allowing the individual to focus on that which nurtures the soul, preserves dignity, and aligns with higher principles. And as I reflected further, I realized that this practice is a microcosm of broader self-discipline, because the same awareness, restraint, and intentionality required to guard the gaze can be applied to thoughts, speech, habits, and actions, fostering a comprehensive approach to personal growth, ethical living, and spiritual alignment. And I began to notice how this conscious cultivation of attention created a sense of inner stability, emotional resilience, and moral coherence, because repeated practice strengthens the heart's capacity to resist impulsivity, discern what is beneficial or harmful, and maintain alignment with values even in the presence of distraction or temptation. And I understood that the true power of lowering the gaze lies not only in the immediate act of avoiding harm, but in the cumulative transformation it produces over time, shaping thought patterns, emotional responses, relational behaviors, and overall character, because each moment of deliberate restraint reinforces the alignment between intention and action, gradually nurturing a heart and mind that are coherent, disciplined, and attuned to principles of virtue, clarity, and ethical awareness. And I realized that this practice cultivates a profound sense of empowerment, because by taking responsibility for what enters one's consciousness, one asserts agency over the inner life, protects the integrity of the heart, and fosters the capacity for discernment, resilience, and intentional living. And through this awareness, I began to see that lowering the gaze is not merely an act of spiritual obedience, but a daily practical exercise in cultivating self-mastery, mindfulness, and moral clarity, because the cumulative effect of each deliberate glance, each conscious choice, each moment of reflection builds a foundation for enduring personal transformation, guiding the heart, mind, and soul toward clarity, virtue, and a life lived with intention, dignity, and alignment with principles that nurture both spiritual and emotional well-being. And I realized that the seemingly simple act of redirecting attention carries profound implications, shaping not only immediate behavior, but the trajectory of the entire life, because over time, these intentional choices cultivate a resilient, coherent, and ethically grounded self capable of navigating challenges, desires, and relationships with wisdom, integrity, and inner peace. As I continued to reflect on the profound implications of lowering the gaze, I began to grasp that this practice is not simply an isolated act of restraint, but a transformative discipline that impacts every aspect of the inner and outer life, because the gaze is deeply intertwined with the workings of the mind, the formation of desire, and the cultivation of moral and spiritual character. And I realized that what we choose to see does not merely affect the moment, subtly shapes the patterns of thought, emotional responses, and behavioral tendencies that define the trajectory of our lives. And this understanding revealed that lowering the gaze is, in fact, a comprehensive practice of self-governance, intentionality, and heart-centered awareness, because each deliberate decision to avert the eyes from harmful stimuli strengthens the capacity to discern, prioritize, and act in alignment with principles that preserve dignity, virtue, and spiritual clarity. And I noticed that the cumulative effect of these small, consistent choices produces profound shifts in character, because when the heart is protected from unnecessary contamination, the mind is free to focus on what nurtures. The emotions are stabilized and the moral compass is reinforced, fostering coherence between intention, thought, and behavior. And I began to understand that this practice is deeply empowering because it teaches the individual to reclaim agency over their attention, to exercise discernment in a world saturated with distractions and temptations, and to cultivate an internal environment in which the heart, mind, and soul can flourish in alignment with higher values. And I realized that the act of lowering the gaze is simultaneously a spiritual, psychological, and relational practice, because it nurtures awareness, self-respect, and ethical sensitivity, while also positively shaping interactions with others by fostering empathy, respect, and humility. And I saw that this practice requires consistent reflection, discipline, and mindfulness because the eyes are constantly exposed to stimuli, and the heart is continuously vulnerable to impressions that can either uplift or undermine integrity. And without conscious engagement, it is easy for attention to drift and for subtle harm to accumulate unnoticed, eroding clarity, balance, and spiritual resilience. And I began to appreciate that this ongoing cultivation of intentional vision is a daily exercise in moral and spiritual literacy because it trains the heart and mind to recognize what is beneficial, what is harmful, and what is aligned with the pursuit of virtue. And through repeated practice, the capacity for self-regulation, ethical awareness, and emotional stability is strengthened, creating a foundation for holistic personal development because the heart, mind, and soul are deeply interconnected, and cultivating clarity and discipline in one dimension inevitably strengthens the others. And I observed that lowering the gaze also nurtures humility, patience, and self-awareness because it requires acknowledgement of the heart's susceptibility, acceptance of the need for conscious guidance, and willingness to engage in persistent effort, and this awareness fosters a deeper understanding of one's inner life, the subtle influences that shape it, and the responsibility each individual bears over the cultivation of their own character. And I realized that this practice is more than abstaining from harmful visuals. It is an intentional shaping of consciousness, a deliberate training of attention, profound exercise in self-respect and moral agency, because every conscious glance that is redirected or restrained reinforces alignment between thought, intention, and action, gradually fortifying the inner life against distraction, impulsivity, and moral erosion. And I began to see that the benefits of this discipline extend into every aspect of life, because a heart and mind trained to focus with awareness and restraint navigate social interactions, personal relationships, and professional environments with clarity, integrity, and ethical discernment, demonstrating that the mastery of attention is foundational to broader moral, emotional, and spiritual growth. And I noticed that the repeated exercise of lowering the gaze cultivates resilience because it teaches the heart and mind to resist immediate gratification in favor of long-term alignment with principles that nurture virtue, clarity, and inner peace. And over time, this discipline strengthens the capacity to face challenges, manage desires, and respond to circumstances with wisdom and composure. And I came to understand that the practice also fosters a profound sense of intentional living because each moment of mindful attention reinforces the individual's commitment to values, ethics, and spiritual alignment, creating a life that is not reactive or distracted, but guided by deliberate choice, awareness, and purpose. And as I reflected on this, I realized that lowering the gaze cultivates not just restraint, but empowerment, self-mastery, and the ability to live in harmony with both the inner self and the wider world, because the heart that has learned to govern its attention gradually develops clarity, moral coherence, emotional stability, and the capacity for conscious engagement in every area of life. And I saw that this seemingly simple act is, in reality, a profound tool for holistic personal transformation because it nurtures virtue, cultivates mindfulness, protects the inner self, and shapes the trajectory of thought, desire, emotion, and behavior over time, demonstrating that discipline over one's gaze is ultimately a practice of cultivating clarity, resilience, dignity, and alignment with principles that honor both the self and the sacredness of the soul, and that this discipline creates a foundation for a life lived with intentionality, ethical awareness, emotional balance, and spiritual depth, because every deliberate glance away from harm strengthens the capacity to navigate life with purpose, mindfulness, and integrity, shaping the heart, mind, and actions in a coherent, sustainable, and transformative way. As I reached a deeper understanding of lowering the gaze, I realized that this practice is far more than a temporary exercise in avoidance. It is a lifelong transformative discipline that shapes the heart, mind, and soul in ways that ripple into every aspect of life, because the gaze is the first point of contact between the external world and the inner consciousness. And what we allow our eyes to dwell upon has subtle yet profound effects on thoughts, emotions, desires, and ultimately character. And I observed that the act of intentionally lowering the gaze is a form of empowerment because it trains the heart to exercise discernment, strengthens the capacity for self-restraint, and reinforces the alignment between intention, thought, and action, allowing the individual to live with greater integrity, clarity, and purpose. And I came to understand that this practice is not merely about avoiding harem images or content, about cultivating a sustained awareness of how attention shapes consciousness, because each glance, each moment of focus carries the potential to influence the trajectory of desires, ethical sensitivity, and spiritual orientation. And this awareness transforms what might seem like a simple act into a profound spiritual and psychological exercise, one that nurtures mindfulness, emotional resilience, and moral coherence. And I noticed that as the practice became more consistent, the subtle transformations it produced began to manifest in everyday life: clearer sense of moral boundaries, an increased capacity for empathy, a heightened awareness of internal and external stimuli, and a growing ability to act with patience, intentionality, and reflection. And I realized that these effects were cumulative because the repeated exercise of conscious attention strengthens neural, emotional, and moral pathways, gradually creating patterns of thought and behavior that are coherent, disciplined, and aligned with higher principles. And I came to see that lowering the gaze also fosters humility and self-awareness because it requires acknowledgement of the heart's vulnerability, recognition of the need for conscious guidance, and consistent effort to prioritize virtue over temporary gratification. And this acknowledgement cultivates a deeper understanding of the self, the influence of the external world, and the responsibility one bears in shaping character, intentions, and interactions. And I observed that this practice extends far beyond the personal because it enhances social interactions, interpersonal relationships, ethical conduct. For a heart trained to govern attention naturally treats others with respect, compassion, and mindfulness, reducing the likelihood of objectification, judgment, or thoughtless reactions. And I realized that lowering the gaze, therefore, is both a personal and relational discipline, shaping not only the inner life, but also the quality of engagement with the world, because intentional attention cultivates clarity, empathy, and moral sensitivity, which are reflected in actions, communication, and decision making. And I began to appreciate that this practice is deeply linked to broader self-discipline, because the focus, restraint, and awareness required to control the gaze gradually translate into mastery over thoughts, emotions, desires, and behaviors in all areas of life, creating a comprehensive framework for personal development, spiritual growth, and ethical living. And I understood that its impact is cumulative and far-reaching because each conscious act of restraint strengthens inner coherence, reinforces moral awareness, and nurtures resilience against impulses, distractions, and unethical influences, shaping the trajectory of the mind and heart toward virtue, clarity, and purpose. And I realized that lowering the gaze also cultivates intentional living, because each deliberate choice to redirect attention fosters alignment between values, intentions, and actions. And this alignment gradually establishes a coherent, disciplined, and reflective inner life, capable of navigating the complexities of the external world with wisdom, patience, and integrity. And as I continued to practice, I noticed a profound sense of empowerment emerging because controlling the gaze fosters agency over the self, reinforces the understanding that every small choice matters, and nurtures the confidence to engage with life consciously rather than reactively. And I came to see that this empowerment is not fleeting, but cumulative, because the repeated exercise of restraint and awareness produces lasting shifts in thought, emotion, and behavior, gradually shaping a life that reflects intentionality, moral clarity, emotional stability, and spiritual alignment. And I realized that the practice of lowering the gaze is ultimately a gateway to holistic personal transformation because it cultivates virtue, strengthens mindfulness, nurtures resilience, and protects the integrity of the heart. And over time, these small, consistent choices accumulate to create a coherent, ethically aligned, and spiritually attuned self that navigates life with clarity, patience, and dignity, demonstrating that this discipline, while seemingly simple, has profound implications for the quality of thought, emotion, relationships, and the overall trajectory of the soul, because each intentional act of redirecting attention is simultaneously an act of protection, cultivation, and empowerment, fostering a heart and mind capable of sustained ethical awareness, emotional coherence, and spiritual resilience. And I realized that through this practice, one gradually develops the capacity to engage with the world with focus, purpose, and alignment, cultivating a life that is not only morally and spiritually grounded, but also emotionally stable, relationally mindful, and deeply intentional. And that the cumulative effect of this practice is a transformation that touches every dimension of life, producing a self that is disciplined, ethically coherent, spiritually aware, and empowered to navigate the complexities of existence with clarity, integrity, and enduring inner peace.